Hello everyone, welcome to the Nullcon webinar series. I hope everyone is doing well. My name is Sakshi and I am part of the Nullcon team. So let me briefly introduce Nullcon to you. The Nullcon conference is a unique platform for security companies and evangelists to showcase their research and technology to the community. We have been running Nullcon security conferences since 2010, where information security is discussed in detail among the industry, government, and the tech community. In this work from home environment, we keep continuing to share knowledge and connect with our global community by running multiple online events like webinars, workshops, training, and resume clinics. In the coming time, we are going to have some exciting sessions on threat modeling for mobile communications, red, purple, and blue team activity using Azure, and many more. Also, happy to let you know that we have announced our Nullcon security trainings in the online edition, which will happen from 23rd September to 26th September 2021. And more details will be put out in the chat box about the same. So coming to our today's guest speaker, we have with us Lavakumar Kuppan, and he is going to share with us his thoughts on technical breakdown of Magecart, the digital robbery. Lavakumar is the founder of Ironwasp Security. He has been publishing his research on JavaScript security from the time of Google years. His research on the security of HTML5 was presented at Blackhat and was covered in Forbes. In addition to several tools on the offensive side and vulnerability scanning side, he currently builds Sboxr, a runtime taint analysis based on DOM XSS scanner. And I would like to welcome Lavakumar on behalf of all of us. And lastly, before we go ahead, a few instructions for the audience. Our talk duration is about 30 minutes, and after that, we will have a question-answer session. You all can ask your question using the chat option after the talk, and I request you all to keep your mic on mute during the session, so there is no disturbance. And without any further delay, I request Lavakumar to take charge of the session. You're on mute, yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot, Sakshi. It was very nice. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be, giving this webinar today. This is the first webinar through the Nullcon series that I'm doing. I've been associated with, Null and Nullcon for a very, very long time, probably since it actually began. So it actually, it's a little different this time, doing it virtually. Otherwise, it's usually physical. You get to meet the audience as well as the organizers and everyone. So, yeah, it's a little different experience, but I hope you find the presentation useful. You can. I know that a lot of us are still kind of getting used to doing Q&A and all of that in a virtual environment. But if you have any questions, you can feel free to drop in the comments at any point of time. I can answer it as and when we cover those appropriate sections. Okay, so with that said, I'll now let me share my screen. Okay, let me know if you are able to see the screen.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so the session today is on what is popularly called as Magecart attack, right? And I'm actually calling it as digital bank robbery because that's in effect what it is. And what we're going to do is we're going to break it down in its technical details about the attack. So if you look at most e-commerce websites, right? E-commerce websites as well as sites which are not necessarily e-commerce, but then they have some kind of a payment gateway interaction. It's very normal that you will end up in a page like this, where you enter your credit card details, right? And what has happened is over the last 3-4 years, right? There's been a group which is roughly called as Magecart. It's a bunch of different hackers, and that's how the attack got its name. So what this group has been doing is it's been finding out different ways by which they can actually, get hold of the credit card details, you would enter into the payment gateway, similar to this, right? And this has become a very big problem. In fact, there are essentially millions of credit card details stolen, and there are hundreds of e-commerce websites that have been hit. In fact, in just 2020, there has been more than 360 e-commerce companies which have been infected. So if you do an average, that comes to about one e-commerce company per day, right, getting infected. Now, this attack does not necessarily have to apply to e-commerce companies, right? Of course, if you're in that space, it is more relevant for you. But then it does not have to necessarily apply to that. Any website which is collecting sensitive information, right, from users, this attack would apply, equally to you as well, right? It's just that the attackers probably have not gone after it using this approach so far. But if something is technically possible, then it's just a question of time before somebody applies it, to collect details of the kind that you collect from users also, right? It could be healthcare information, it could be, their financial data, or whatever the case might be. Okay. And what makes Magecart interesting, right, compared to the other kinds of attacks, is in a lot of ways it's simplicity and the area in which the attack actually works, right? In most vulnerabilities or exploits, what you'll actually see is they find a vulnerability on the server side, and that's where the data actually gets stolen. But what happens with Magecart is you have this checkout page. This is essentially a HTML page open in a browser, right? If an attacker is able to get just a few lines of JavaScript code injected into this page, then what they're able to do is essentially collect the credit card information that you enter into the site and send it to their servers, right? And because this happens entirely on the client side, it has been a very difficult attack to detect, because most, if not all, security monitoring as well as your detection and prevention measures are all focused on your server side, right? So all your CCTV cameras are pointing at your front gate, and then here you have these guys essentially entering in and stealing information from your back gate, right? Which is essentially unmonitored. So that's what is very unique about this attack. And there have been cases where in an e-commerce portal called as Newegg, the attackers were able to steal credit card details from the customers for about 9 months before it was actually detected, right? And even then, they only found it because customers were complaining that, hey, my credit card, looks like my credit card is stolen and somebody else is trying to use it. So it was not found due to any technical monitoring, but it was because of customer complaints. So now that companies are getting more, you can say, aware about this attack, and they're looking at ways to actually put in countermeasures, right? So so I hope that this talk would kind of help you in understand the technical details of the attack as to how it works, and more importantly, find out what are the different options you have in terms of being able to protect your website against this attack, right? Both from a detection as well as a prevention point of view. And we'll give some recommendations of what we think is a good defensive strategy against this kind of an attack, right? So that's the rough overview, or essentially how I hope the session would go. Okay, a little bit about myself. Now Sakshi has covered it already, so I'll just skip this section. I've been working on JavaScript security from 2010, and 2019 is when I released Sboxr, which is a scanner for DOM XSS. And this year, we've actually started a client-side security monitoring service called DOMDog. And a lot of things you will see here is as part of the research I've done in creating the service. Okay, so now when we look at Magecart, it's very easy to compare it to an actual bank robbery, except for the fact that this is digital. So if you look at a bank robbery, I'm sure you would have seen a lot of movies, which cover the bank robberies. They typically have 3 stages, right? Which is the robbers have to enter into the bank, usually without triggering any alarms, because the moment an alarm is triggered, cops would typically show up. So you enter into the bank in a stealthy way. You get access to the cash. This is the point at which they usually point a gun at the cashier or somebody and ask them to open the vault for them. And the third is once they have access to the cache, they'll have to exit the bank along with the cache, without getting caught. Right. So these are the three. If you break it down, these are the three stages of an actual physical bank robbery. And interestingly, you have these exact same three stages when you look at Magecart as well, right? So the first part of the attack, or stage one, is where the attacker has to somehow inject their JavaScript into the affected website, right? If the affected website is British Airways, they have to make sure that their JavaScript is somehow running on British Airways portal, and more importantly, it has to run on the page, where the user is entering the checkout page, essentially, where the user is entering the credit card details, right? So that's stage one. Stage two is where this JavaScript, which is injected by the attacker, is able to actually read and store the credit card details or any other sensitive information which is entered by the user on their website. Okay. Stage two is usually the easier stage, and stage three is where the JavaScript has access to the information, but then it has to actually send it, to the attacker's server, right? And that's the data exfiltration part. So stage one and stage three. Stage one, I would say, is the most complicated. It requires the most amount of skill. Stage three requires, it's a little bit complicated, requires a little bit of skill, and attackers have used some very ingenious ways of exfiltrating data. I'll cover it in a little while. Stage two is typically a very simple and straightforward kind of stage, but there could be a lot of interesting things an attacker can do there as well. So we'll look at that also. So what I'll do is I'll go through each of these different stages, and I'll say how they what are the technical components to those stages. Okay, so and while we talk about it, we'll restrict ourselves to the attack techniques which have been used by Magecart attackers so far, and the publicly known attacks. Right, step one, where the malicious code is actually injected into the website. So what the attackers have done so far is they'll exploit a vulnerability on the application, right? So for example, this has happened in the case of Magento. Magento is a popular e-commerce portal. So they've been able to exploit a vulnerability on Magento, and using that vulnerability, they go and modify a JavaScript file which is being loaded by Magento. I'm sorry, which is being loaded by the target application. So if you go to any website, right, you would typically see a bunch of JavaScript code, being loaded by the site. And some of this code, it could be from a CDN. Some of this could be from, the same physical server on which you have your online whatever platform like Magento, or even if it's a custom implementation, right? So if an attacker is able to compromise the server, and if they're able to observe that you're serving JavaScript from the same physical server, then they can actually go in and modify the content of an existing well-known JavaScript file that your site is legitimately loaded, right? So this is something which they've done. And another thing which they've done is actually exploited a cloud misconfiguration. So what they did was they scanned the internet for AWS buckets which had public write access, which means anybody with an AWS account could essentially go and modify the contents of those AWS buckets. So they scanned the internet for that, and when they found websites which have the AWS buckets which are publicly writable, and when they found JavaScript code stored in those buckets, they actually went and overrode those, as in they injected their malicious JavaScript into those existing JS files. So what this did was, the websites which were actually loading JavaScript from these buckets, all of those were compromised, right? So this is here you have cloud misconfiguration, which led to an attacker using that to inject JavaScript into their actual website's client side. And a third technique, which a lot of them have been able to use, is they have compromised third parties. Now most websites, they use a lot of third parties, whether it's for analytics, whether it's for user tracking, advertising, customer engagement, marketing. There are a lot of different reasons why websites typically use third parties, and third parties are nothing but JavaScript code that you include onto your website on the client side, right? So instead of compromising actual application, right, they have been able to compromise the third party, and they have been able to modify the code which the third party is serving. So that way, they have been able to enter into the victim's website. In all of these cases, what they do is they actually inject a very small snippet of code through these techniques, and this snippet would further load the actual full exploit, right, which constantly keeps getting updated. So there is something interesting they do, when they actually do this. I can just talk about it briefly. Let's say, for example, Flipkart, right? So in case of Flipkart, if you look at this, you can see that Flipkart is loading resources from a domain called flixkart.com, right? So Flixkart, presumably is something which Flipkart owns. It's a domain owned by Flipkart, and they're using it, as a CDN to load static resources, right? So what an attacker would do is they would try and look for they would try and look for domains which are very similar to the target domain. Let's say instead of Flixkart, which is what Flipkart was actually using, they would search for Flixkart, for example, right? And the domain is available. So they would register this domain, and what their exploit would do is, what they originally inject would be just a 2 or 3 line piece of JavaScript code, and this would further load JavaScript from flixkart.com, right? And because these domains are very, lexically similar to the legitimate websites, the chances that they would actually trigger an alert, might be much lower, right? So this is a trick which these guys have been using. All right, so that was step 1, where they're able to get into the website, using different, techniques. Those are not the only ways in which someone can technically enter the website, but those are the most popular techniques which have been used by attackers so far. Okay? When it comes to defense, we'll talk about a more comprehensive way of defending against code coming in. But for now, let's stick to these 3 techniques. Now, step 2. Now the attackers have entered into the bank, right? Now they have to get access to the cache, right? So how do they capture the user's credit card details? Now here, again, the techniques that have been used so far is they show a fake form to the users, right? A fake HTML form. If you have JavaScript running in a page, you can essentially show whatever you want on the page. The users would enter their credit card details in the form, and then they would collect, right? So that's a simple way. Another technique they use is to actually listen for keystrokes, and listening for keystrokes is actually very simple. It's a 1-line code. My internet is strangely slow. Right. Right. So there's a single, line of JS code, which if an attacker actually executes, then every time you press, the user tries to enter something on the page, the attacker is able to actually capture it, and they can collate all of that together, and they can send it to the server. So that's one technique that they use. And another technique is to actually look at the content of the input fields. Let me go to Flipkart again. So here, yeah. So what I'm doing here is, I'm just looking at the contents of the first input field, right? And I'm doing it in a regular basis. So every time I enter something on the page, we can actually see that my JavaScript is able to read this, right? So this is something which the attackers have done, which is they will just listen for data being entered into a text field with a timer, right? And as and when the data is being entered, they'll collect it and then they will send it to the server. So so one is they can show a fake form, they can listen for keystrokes, or they can actually look at the contents of the input field, and then they can keep reading it on a regular basis, right? Okay. Second. Oh yeah, step 3. Now this is where the attackers have managed to get access to the data, and this is where they will actually exfiltrate the data, right? They'll have to send it from the victim's browser to their server, and the different ways in which they've used is, so far they've used Ajax calls, which are actually the simplest way to do this. They'll send an Ajax call to their server. Now again, for sending the Ajax call, if you remember, I gave the example of Flixcart, right? So they would register a domain very similar to the actual vulnerable site, and they would make Ajax calls to that. They can do Ajax calls. They can say do something simple like load an image, and the URL of the image can actually point to the attacker server, and they can send the user data that way. They can. This is something which is very ingenious, which attackers have used, which is to make use of legitimate third-party services. Okay. For example, most websites use Google Analytics. There are a lot of websites which use Telegram. There are a lot of websites which use Sentry for error collection. Right? But when they use these services, what they do is the account ID or the API key that they're using actually belongs to the site owner's account. Right? What the attackers do is they would make calls from the victim's browser to Google Analytics, or to Sentry, but they would use their account key, right? So what happens is, because you're making a legitimate call, all of this information is collected inside your Google Analytics account, or it's collected as your Sentry logs, and the attackers can just go and get the credit card information from there, right? So they don't even have to go through the effort of hosting their own server and collecting all of this. So they can just make use of legitimate third-party services. Now, the interesting part with this is, if you're looking at outbound connections, these are connections made to legitimate services, right? So unless your monitoring is very precise and you're even trying to see which account the request is going to, you would never know that your website is leaking data to a third party, right? So this was a very smart thing they did, and yeah, if they have been able to compromise the server, then they would actually send the data to the server, and then they would store it on the server side and then send it later on to their system. And if they have compromised any third-party servers, right? Let's say, for example, there is a university somewhere, right? And they have compromised the web server of the university. Then they would collect this data, send it to that server, use it as essentially a drop server, and then from there they would exfiltrate further, right? So when you look at your traffic or your CSP alerts or whatever the case might be, then it looks like you're talking to a legitimate website, and it might not trigger any alarm bells for you, but then the actual legitimate website has been compromised, right? So these are different ways in which they've been able to exfiltrate data, right? So we looked at the 3 different stages, which is entering into the website. Second is collecting the user's data. The third is exfiltrating data. Okay. Now we'll look at the different ways, different options you have as a site owner to essentially protect yourself against this kind of an attack, or at the very least detect, that your site is affected and it's leaking customer information, right? At the very least, you should be able to do that much. And to do that, we'll look at what are the different options, right? And we'll evaluate these options against these 3 stages, which is entering the site, collecting the data, and then sending the data out. And we'll see how each of these different techniques perform in each of those different stages. And then finally, we'll give an overview and see what is your best possible strategy for doing detection. Okay, so when we look at detection options, right? Again, you have 3 options. One is remote synthetic transaction. and the other is JavaScript agents, and the third is CSP, or content security policy. And we'll look at them in detail. I think CSP out of these three is something which a lot of you would be familiar with already, because it's a very common security approach. Okay, so we'll see the strengths as well as the limitations of each of these approaches. We'll start with the first one, remote synthetic transaction. Remote synthetic transaction essentially means it's a kind of monitoring where you do not set up anything on your server, right? But a vendor, or it could be something which you could do it yourself as well. What they would do is they would visit your website like an actual end user visits your website, right? So that's why we call it as a synthetic transaction. So they would simulate an actual end user. This could be even an actual physical, tester going through the flow of, actually browsing your website and trying to fill in all the details. Or it could be, an automated puppeteer or a Selenium instance, or it could be something else, right? But essentially, it means someone visiting your website, going through the user journey of selecting a product and doing a checkout, right? Actual, essentially simulating an actual end user scenario, right? And while they perform this, what they would do is they'll actually look at all of the different activities that your browser is doing, and then they can detect if, let's say, for example, it's loading a new JavaScript from a new website, or if it's, sending in HTTP request to a new website, or if it's doing something, which it normally should not do, or it was not doing earlier, right? So they would create a baseline for your website. And if there's a variation from or a deviation from the baseline, then they can actually tell you that, hey, your website is doing something which it was not doing earlier, right? And that could be something which would give you indication that your website is probably compromised. Now, the good thing is with this approach is very easy to get started, because you do not really have to implement anything on your side. This is done remotely by whoever it is. If it's vendor or if it's yourself, it's done remotely. And because it's done remotely, because there's nothing you have to install on your website, there is no performance impact, right? This has absolutely no performance as well as functional impact on your website, and very little approvals. You're not giving access to your customer data to any third party, nothing of that kind, right? So that's a very good part about this. And the other part is it can technically monitor all three stages. When I say technically monitor all three stages, this kind of an approach has the technical ability to monitor, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Whether if someone's, if the new piece of JS code is running on the side, or if if a new piece of JavaScript code is trying to read contents of a form, or if data is being sent to a new external third party, right? It can do all three of monitor for all three of those. But the effectiveness of this technique essentially comes down to how stealthy it is, right? Now, one of the downsides of this technique is also that because it's done remotely, you as the site owner, or you as the person in charge of security, you have very little visibility into what exactly is covered in this, right? Let's say, for example, does the person doing this remote monitoring, do they look at WebRTC request, right? Now, if they do not look at WebRTC request, and if the attackers are using WebRTC to leak data, then you will not be able to pick that up, right? If you're doing an in-browser monitoring, then it's because it's visible to you, you can actually see how much coverage the approach is giving. Now, because this is done remotely, that is something you have very little visibility into. So this is something you'll have to speak to that whoever is giving you this monitoring and find out, what are the different parameters that they actually monitor. You can tell them, hey, this scenario, do you monitor for this, right? How do you actually do this? Is this shown in your dashboard something, right? So you can get it clarified with the individual service providers. That is one. So, visibility into what exactly they're monitoring is not there. Number two is that if the monitoring is noisy, right, or if it's not stealthy. So what I mean by that is, let's say, for example, if the monitoring is being done through Selenium, right? So they have recorded the actual customer journey through Selenium, and they replay this, and Selenium just goes through this. It runs the whole process. It waits for another 10 minutes, and then it does the same thing again, right? So if this is what's going on, then the attacker script, right, it could essentially see if it's running inside an automated browser. So there are very telltale signs, signatures. If you're using any automation frameworks like Selenium or Puppeteer, by which a JavaScript code running inside, running in the page could actually detect if it's running in one of those environments, right? So what the attacker could do is they could check if they're running in a simulated environment, or, and not in an actual legitimate user's browser, and they could essentially turn off all of their activities when they run in a simulated browser, right? So in this case, what will happen is when you're monitoring it through Selenium, everything looks perfect because the attacker's code is not really doing anything. But then on the actual end user's browser, the code behaves differently, right? So if the system is not stealthy, then it might lose its effectiveness. And the other problem is that it also depends on how widespread the attack is, right? Let's say, for example, if the attack works in such a way that it's only collecting credit card information from users who are, say, located in the East Coast, right? Then if you are, the Selenium or whatever monitoring you're doing, the synthetic transaction, if that server is located on the West Coast, right, then the way in which the attacker's JavaScript would behave would be very different for an actual end user located on the East Coast versus your simulated environment on the West Coast, right? So you would think that everything looks fine, whereas all your customers who are on East Coast are all getting affected, right? So that's another downside. So this could also depend on the time. Let's say, for example, the attacker could only do it on random browsers, which is out of 10 users, the attacker script could only run on one, right? In all of the other 9, it could remain dormant. Now again, your remote monitoring system, because it's only simulating one end user, the chances of it picking it are less, right? So those are some downsides when you use a remote synthetic monitoring system. Okay. So we'll go to the next approach, which is content security policy. Now, content security policy is probably the most common and most popular approach. A lot of you would already be familiar with this approach. With content security policy, you can monitor stage 1 and you can monitor stage 3. You cannot look at stage 2, which is, you cannot see if if an attacker's code is trying to actually read the contents of your form. You can look at only stage 1 and 3. Now, the upsides with CSP is, because it's a web standard, so it's very clear as to how the system actually works. It's got very good performance because it's natively integrated into the browser. The performance impact is almost, it's near zero performance impact, right? But then there are some downsides, or I would essentially say they are blind spots when you look at CSP-based monitoring. So one is it cannot detect changes made to an existing JavaScript on the page. So if you look at some of the examples I spoke about earlier, where they have been able to compromise the server through Magento, or the attackers were able to use a misconfiguration and modify JavaScript in an EC2 bucket. In all of those cases, the JavaScript code was already present on the website. It's a legitimate JavaScript file. The attackers went and modified its content, right? They did not inject a new JavaScript file. They did not load JavaScript from a new external domain. They were just modifying existing JavaScript code. Now, things like this, you cannot detect just through CSP. You either need to have sub-resource integrity, which is easier. It's easy to recommend sub-resource integrity. If you look at most pen test reports, the pen testers would say, hey, you're not using CSP, add CSP. You're not using sub-resource integrity, add sub-resource integrity. But these are very, very easy to put in a recommendation. These are single lines. But I've spoken to lots of folks who are in charge of the security of these applications, and getting CSP policy in a good place is a big deal. And sub-resource integrity could be, putting that could be very difficult, except for a few external third parties, maybe. Right? So for those cases, you can at least have a remote JavaScript integrity monitoring. But just with CSP, you would not be able to detect those kind of attacks. And the second is, if, for example, you've already put a whitelist of certain domains or an allow list of certain domains, and if the attacker is loading JavaScript from those domains, right? Because let's say there's a third party, a legitimate third party, the attacker has been able to compromise the third party, right? And they're loading JavaScript from that. Or some of you would have actually seen this. There was a recent vulnerability on Cloudflare's CDN.js, which, theoretically, if that vulnerability was found by an attacker, they could have gone and uploaded any JavaScript code on CDN.js, right? And CDN.js is part of a lot of websites' CSP policy, right? So if you have already added a domain to your whitelist, and if the attacker is able to upload their JavaScript code to that server, then you cannot detect it through CSP. And third is, if the JavaScript that is injected is through XSS, right? Now, this is something we have not seen so far, where Magecart attackers have used XSS to, enter into the website. But if something is technically possible, then it's just a question of, the right group using it, right? So if they're using XSS or DOM XSS to inject their code into your website, then detecting this would essentially come down to how you have configured your CSP, right? DOM XSS particularly is, very tricky with the current CSP implementations. They usually allow unsafe inline, a lot of those CSP policies. So, DOM XSS remains an open, you could say, avenue for an attacker to inject their JS code into the website. So for stage one, these are some limitations which CSP has. Now, if you're looking at stage three, where the data is actually going to be exfiltrated, from your domain to outside, then the technique which I spoke about earlier, which attackers were using, where they were sending data to legitimate third parties, but they were sending it to their own accounts. Let's say, for example, they'll send it to their own Google Analytics account, right? So if they're doing that, then you cannot detect it through CSP, because CSP only looks at the host name, or even it could even go up to the URL level, but it will not look at the content of a request that you're making, right? So, that's a blind spot for you right there, even with CSP. WebRTC is something which, it's an API which can be used for peer-to-peer communication, and CSP cannot currently monitor WebRTC communications, right? So that's an open channel for your attackers. DNS prefetch. Now, this again is something which attackers can make use of, where existing your CSP policies like connect SRC or default SRC will not prevent these DNS-based lookups from happening. Another technique is actually using window.name and navigating the user to another domain. I can just show you a quick demo of that. Okay. So I've gone to DomDog. Now, DomDog is a website that I manage, which has a bunch of DOM XSS vulnerabilities. It's like a test bed for DOM XSS vulnerabilities. So what I'll do here is, let's say, for example, the attackers have managed to steal the user's credit card details. What they can actually do is, they can, instead of sending it to their, making an Ajax call or making a WebRTC request or whatever the case might be, they can just store that information in this property called window.name. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about window.name is it remains consistent when you navigate to another page, right? Oops. Okay, so I'll go to another page, and you can see that the window.name still retains its actual value even through a refresh. But what's even interesting is, if I navigate to another domain, right? Now I've essentially redirected the user to google.com. Okay. If I go back, if I look at window.name, it still retains the original value. So this data was set, from DOM-GOAT website through JavaScript, and the attacker redirected the user to a completely different domain. So what would actually happen is, the attacker can store it in window.name, and they can use location.href to redirect the user to the attacker's website, right? The attacker's website can read this property, store this information, redirect the user back to the actual website, right? So for the user, this thing happens very quickly. They cannot visually determine what's going on unless you're looking at you have an HTTP proxy and you're actually intercepting traffic, right? So this is a very stealthy way by which you can actually leak data outside your domain. And if an attacker is using this technique, window.name and navigating to user to another domain, then you cannot detect it or block it using CSP. Right? And the last approach is if an attacker is able to actually use post message. Right? Now, we did see an example where attackers, actually in real world cases, they were able to compromise third parties JavaScript, and they were able to essentially inject code through that. So imagine an attacker is compromised a third party iframe, right? And so what they're doing is, instead of sending the data from the user's browser directly to their server, they actually use post message to send the data from the parent frame to the iframe, right? Now, from the iframe, which is third party iframe, they send it further to another domain that becomes the fourth party. So if you are doing this kind of a communication, then CSP cannot detect it, because neither can it look at post message, nor can it look at the contents of another iframe loaded from a different origin, right? So that those are opaque to CSP. So this again is a limitation when it comes to a CSP based approach for looking at Magecart monitoring. So stage 2 is not possible. Stage 1, I discussed a bunch of limitations. Stage 3, I've discussed a bunch of limitations. Okay. All right. Now let's go to the third approach, which is a JavaScript agent. A JavaScript agent is typically where, like a vendor, he gives you a piece of JavaScript file, and they say, hey, you know what, you can actually load it onto your website, and this will look at the it'll look at all of your DOM activities in the browser, and it can determine if something malicious is taking place, right? So this is a real-time monitoring system, and this is a very popular system as well. There are a lot of vendors who actually take this approach, where you can sign up, they'll give you a piece of JavaScript file, you'll have to load it at the top of your website, and once you do it, they can give you a lot of monitoring, kind of similar to what CSP gives you, similar kind of a monitoring, but done purely through JavaScript. Now, the upsides for this is it can actually monitor stage 2, which your CSP was not able to do. But its ability to monitor stage 1 is very, very limited. So I'm not even going to consider that this can monitor stage 1, which is it cannot reliably monitor if an attacker is able to inject a new piece of JavaScript code into the website. But it can monitor stage 2 and 3, and we'll see how well it performs in stage 2 and 3. One upside for this approach compared to CSP is maintaining CSP policy is usually a nightmare. But this approach is agent-based approach, usually because it's given by professional vendors. These are much easier to manage. There's a very simple, nice looking GUI that you get, and you can actually go and configure policies and get alerts from there. Okay, so when it comes to stage 2, where you are actually looking at the keystrokes of the user, or you're looking at how a script can actually read the contents of the user. So if you remember, we had spoke about 3 ways in which you can do stage 3, which is you can show a fake form, or you can look at keystrokes of the user, right, key press events, or you can look at you can on a regular basis read the value property of HTML input field, right? So these are 3 things we actually spoke about. Now, what this does is it tries to monitor all of that. So you know what? Actually, before I even go there, maybe I should just briefly talk about how the JavaScript agent approach actually works. So the way this approach works is they do something called as API hooking, right? So I'll give an example. Now consider this API. Fetch is a built-in API inside your browsers. So this is an API which your JavaScript code normally uses to make HTTP requests. Okay. So when I type fetch, it says that it's the native code. So this is the built-in API of fetch. Now what you can actually do is you can overwrite it. So let's say here, I store fetch, the original fetch in a variable called original fetch API, and now I'm assigning a new function to the fetch API, right? So because JavaScript is dynamic, I can essentially override a native function just like I would, override a regular variable in JavaScript. Right? So the moment I do this, now if I type fetch, what I'll actually see is it doesn't say the native code anymore, but instead it's showing the code which I've just written. Right? So this is what these JavaScript agents typically do, which is they take a native API, they overwrite it with their own API, and what they can do is when the application tries to make use of the native API, then the agent is what is called first. So they can actually look at it. They can determine if the API is being called by the proper third party, if it's being called securely, and then they can decide to call the native API internally. Right? I can just show a simple example of that. Okay. So let me hook the. Okay, I'll go here. I'll type something. I'll search for an area. Now, this is an area in Chennai. You can see that. Yeah. So every time I do this, you can see that an XML HTTP request or an AJAX call is actually being made. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'll go and I'll override the fetch API. Okay. And now if I type something, you can actually see that when the AJAX call was made by the page, our code is able to hook it, is able to read it, and it's able to see that, hey, this is the URL to which a request is being made, and these are the actual contents which is being sent to that particular URL. Right? So this is how JavaScript agents actually work, right? So they hook into native APIs and they inject their own logic, which can actually do customization, right? Now, one of the downsides for this is actually performance, because a lot of work is done in the JavaScript layer, so performance is an issue. But if we go back to this approach, where when you're looking at stage 2, let's say I've hooked into the key press event, and let's say I've hooked into the when you try to read the dot value property, I've hooked into that as well. But still, there are a lot of different ways in which you can leak details. So there is this nice article which is written by a researcher. I don't know his name. So they have this domain called ad tech madness. So if you go into this, there is about 7 or 8 different techniques that they've listed out, and each of these techniques are if you hook into the key press event, or if you hook into the dot value event, then it would be difficult for you to detect these kind of approaches, right? So this is something you can take a look at. I was going to include some actual code examples here, but due to time I've not been able to do this. But essentially, just looking at the stage at which attacker's code is being read, right? So that is not a very trustworthy approach, because it can be bypassed in a bunch of different ways, and you can also bypass it in. Let's see if I can give an example here. Yeah. Okay, if you look at this example here, let's say this is the code which is written by an actual website, where every time you fill in a form, right, then this is what typically happens. So what they do is they read the content of the input field, they store it to a variable, they trim the value, they put it through a regex, they check if it's of a specific format, And then if it's valid, then they would actually make a fetch request, right? So what usually JavaScript agents try to do is they try and they hook into this particular property, right, where the dot value property is being accessed. And if they see that a new JavaScript code is reading this value, then they will trigger an alert, right? But what an attacker can do is, instead of hooking into this value, or instead of reading this property, they can hook into string.trim. So whenever this credit card value is being trimmed here, then they would get access to that value. Or they can hook into regex.text API, just like I hooked into fetch. They could hook into this, and whenever the actual credit card information is put into the regex call, the attacker can get access to it. Or the attacker can hook into the fetch API, right? So when the website is finally going to actually send this credit card information to the server, right? It's going to use the fetch API. So the attacker can hook into the fetch API, and they can get the credit card information not from the form, but from the Ajax call, right? So even if you use an agent, and if the agent is looking at the different input fields, and if it's seeing if any illegitimate website, or if any illegitimate JavaScript code is accessing those fields, there are still ways in which an attacker can read those data without actually triggering the monitoring JavaScript agent, right? So there are limitations to this approach. And number 3 is the JavaScript agent. It can monitor stage 3, which is the data exfiltration stage. But again, there are limitations into what it can actually do, right? So one is, it cannot monitor requests which are made by CSS. Now, CSS, as you know, is very common in websites, and CSS can further load external resources. So you can say that, hey, for this div element, I want my background to be this image. So when you specify that in CSS, the browser will try to load that image from the server, right? So if you're doing JavaScript agents-based monitoring, then you cannot monitor these requests which are made by CSS. And another downside is you cannot monitor requests which are made from iframes of SRC doc or data iframes. I can actually show you an example of this. Okay, I'll go to DOM code. Okay, so here, this is the parent website. When I look at the fetch API is a native API. So let me do one thing. Let me try and hook this. Okay, so I hooked the fetch API. So now if you look at the fetch API, this is being monitored, right? So this is typically what a JavaScript agent would actually do. But so if an attacker is trying to send data outside using fetch, then the JavaScript agent method will get called, and it will get to know that something unusual is happening. But what an attacker can actually do is they can inject a new iframe into the website. So I'm actually including an iframe, and this is not an iframe which points to a different domain, but this is actually an SRC doc iframe. Okay, so this, for all essential purposes, has access to the same origin. Okay, I've injected this iframe. Now the iframe is visible here, but I could just make it with 0 pixels, so it's completely invisible. So if you look at the fetch API again, this is being monitored, but now you can see that there's a new iframe window. If I switch to the iframe window, and then if I look at the fetch API, that's the native API, right? So what an attacker can do is, although the fetch API is being monitored by your JavaScript agent, they could inject an iframe, and then the iframe could, for the iframe can actually make these Ajax calls, and the APIs in the iframe will not be monitored by the JavaScript agent, right? So that's a blind spot. So similarly, requests which are made through DNS prefetch, they cannot be found. If data is set through inner HTML property, it gets very hard. For example, I'll just go here. Now here, if you see, I was trying to set the inner HTML property with some HTML code, right? Now imagine I was doing this instead of an iframe, let's say, I'm doing this. So here I have an HTML tag which has an image in it. It's trying to load an image from an attacker's website, right? And it's sending the user's data as part of it. So now if I'm going to do this, then it gets very hard for the JavaScript agent to actually, forget blocking, even detect that I'm loading an image from an attacker.com, because as far as, even though this property can be hooked by the JavaScript agent, for the JavaScript agent, this is just a piece of string, right? So to find out if the string actually has an HTML tag in it, and if it's loading a image from somewhere, it has to parse that piece of string into HTML, right? And which is a very, very performance expensive process. And if it starts doing this, then the JavaScript agent would actually slow down your website by a great deal. So typically what the JavaScript agents do is they don't look at properties of this kind, which means that an attacker could use these properties, leak data. Your JavaScript agent cannot, in most cases, detect that. Okay, and just like CSP, it cannot detect data which is sent through post message API and through a fourth party. Okay, right. So those were the different detection approaches, and let's try and summarize. Which is, with each detection approach, I told you what are the limitations and what are their strengths as well. So in net, I would say that 100% detection, although I'm a vendor who is building a solution which does Magecart detection, I can tell you very candidly that detecting 100% is not possible, right? No matter which approach you use, most vendors would try and tell you that, hey, our solution is a silver bullet, but technically that's just not possible. I just gave you a full technical breakdown just before this, right? But what you can do is you can improve your odds of being detected. So what happens is, the simpler attacks, the more comprehensive your monitoring is, the greater the odds of you detecting attacks. So the simpler the attack, the greater the odds that you will actually pick it up. It would have to be a very, very sophisticated attack to be able to slip through all of your different cracks if you do a proper detection approach. So one thing you can do is monitor all three stages, right? I told you what are the three different stages of the attack. So you need to ensure that you have some kind of monitoring system which works on all of those different stages. It could mean you use 2 different techniques or 3 different techniques, but you'll have to look at all of those 3 different stages. So that if an attacker is able to bypass detection in one stage, then the other stage triggers a detection. So the best way to do that is to actually use a combination of content security policy, JavaScript agent, remote monitoring, DOM XSS elimination, and JavaScript integrity checking. If you have a combination of these 5 things, then your odds of finding Magecart, it goes up to its theoretical maximum, right? It's not 100%, but it goes up as far as it possibly can, technically can. And in terms of priority, right, because there are too many things, it's a little overwhelming, right? So to make it simple, this is how I would say you can prioritize the monitoring. I would say start with remote monitoring, because remote monitoring can technically, if you have a very candid conversation with the person who is giving you this monitoring, find out what are the different parameters they actually look at, then that gives you the ability to monitor all 3 stages essentially, right? And it can detect most of these different variations. And as long as the attacker is not being too sophisticated, then they would not try and detect if they're running in a simulated environment and change their behavior. And it's also the easiest way to get started, right? So remote monitoring is step 1. Is probably the thing I'll recommend highest. The second is CSP, for obvious reasons, because it's a web standard, everybody understands it. You have probably 2-3 people in your security team right now, who understand CSP and they can get something implemented. Right? CSP is not perfect, but if you combine it along with remote monitoring, it gives you a very good depth. And third is the JavaScript agent. Whatever gets missed out through the first 3 approaches, the first 2 approaches, the JavaScript agent can come in, and then eliminating DOM XSS, and then finally JavaScript integrity checking. right? So if I had to kind of try and prioritize your detection approaches, I would put them in this order. Right? So if you have covered till 5, then you are at the highest level of protection, and you can start with number 1. Right. So that's essentially what I wanted to cover, right? And this was fairly technical and it was a little heavy, but then I hope it gave you a little bit of idea of what could actually go wrong with Magecart attacks detection as well as prevention on the website, and it hopefully gave you a very good technical overview of how these attacks work and how these detection mechanisms work. So if you have further questions, you can always drop me a line. I don't know if you have time for Q&A here, but I'm always open to answering questions on a personal front as well if you reach out to me. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Lavakumar, for this amazing informative session. I am sure our participants must have found some important knowledge inputs from it. And if anybody has any quick questions, we can. Okay, so we have one comment. We can see a lot of payment pages now accept UPI. It seems that it will be safe way to make payments. So just a comment, not a question.
Yes, that's definitely true. The more we move away from credit cards and stuff like that, it's definitely a safer way to make payments, no doubt about it. But one thing we'll have to be wary of is, in spite of that, we still do enter a lot of PII data on websites, right? So that is still an area of concern. But yeah, UPI is definitely making things safer for end users. That's a good point. Yes, I agree with you.
Okay, let's just give them like a couple of seconds in case they have any questions. I guess there are no other questions. So thank you once again, and thank you all for your participation in today's webinar session. We have our next webinar on threat modeling for mobile communication systems by Sid Rao on 17th September. Hope to see you there. Thank you all. Bye.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Hope to see you all in person in Nullcon next year.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.